Good morning and welcome to the City of Lewisville's Consolidated Plan and Assessment of Fair Housing Community Town Hall. This is the third of our town halls that we're holding to get community input related to about $4 million that the City of Lewisville will receive over the next 5 years to assist low and moderate income families and to help with community development in the city. And so here's our agenda for today. The presentation is about 20 to 25 minutes long, and then we're reserving plenty of time afterwards for questions and discussion and community comment. So I will introduce myself just briefly, and then we're going to do a little bit of an overview of the planning process just so that we understand how long it takes and what all the elements of the planning process are that we're going to be discussing. And then we're going to look at local data. Of the planning process, just so that we understand how long it takes and what all the elements of the planning process are. Should I keep going? Okay. We could hear it on the speakers. We're going to look at some local data because our approach is if you know better, you can do better. And so we're going to go over some local census data that helps understand some of the issues that families in Lewisville are facing, especially related to housing and housing affordability. And then we have been engaging stakeholders over the past couple of weeks, and we'll be continuing to engage stakeholders. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what feedback we've received so far about where the city should be prioritizing its funding, as well as some of its plans and its strategies. And then we'd love to hear from you, especially folks who are here today, as well as folks who are turning in online. So my name is Maureen Milligan. I'm a consultant with the National Development Council. We're a national nonprofit organization. I'm based here in Dallas, Texas, so very short drive to Lewisville, Texas. We're a nonprofit that focuses on primarily three things: small business support and development, so we're a small business lender. We also focus on affordable housing, all aspects of it. We're an affordable housing developer. We help finance affordable housing, and we work with cities on plans related to affordable housing. And then we also have training and technical assistance, where we support local governments, state governments, and local nonprofits to build their capacity to engage in community development efforts. So very excited to be here today. So there are two different plans that we are working with city staff on. The consolidated plan that's related to HUD funding for community development, as well as the assessment of fair housing, which is an associated plan that really looks at all of the various factors that impact a family's ability to access housing in the city of Lewisville. And so this graphic shows that at the center of all these planning process is the City of Lewisville Comprehensive Plan that really is your vision for how you'd like the city to develop, what strategies should be used to grow the City of Lewisville into the city that you'd really like it to be. And so that's Lewisville 2025, which had extensive community engagement when that was developed a number of years ago. And then all of these additional efforts really feed into and are influenced by the comprehensive plan. So as the city's thinking about its budget and its development code, that again is thinking about how do we want the city of Lewisville to grow. And so if you look on the right-hand side, that assessment of fair housing and the consolidated plan are plans that also are influenced by the comprehensive plan because they also are looking at long-term, how do we develop and grow and stabilize the city of Lewisville. And then in some cities, they also will work on separate economic development plans that think about what businesses do we want to recruit, how do we want to support the businesses that are in the city of Lewisville, as well as even more in-depth housing plans of how do we really develop strategies and implement strategies to create housing that people across the income spectrum can afford. So the first plan that we're seeking your feedback on is the Community Development Block Grant Program. And as you can see, the Community Development Block Grant Program focuses on supporting activities to build stronger and more resilient communities. And it does it in 3 ways. One is through a focus on low and moderate income individuals. 2 is on blight and slum clearance, which is really more, those are kind of older terms, but it's more neighborhood stabilization. How do we create infrastructure and supports in neighborhoods so that neighborhoods are stabilized? And then urgent needs. So sometimes if communities are hit by things like tornadoes or other severe disasters, they can use their CDBG funding on urgent needs. But as you could see over on the left-hand graphic, 70% of the funding needs to be spent to support low and moderate income individuals. So that's what we're going to be focused on today. And as we're thinking about feedback, how are we able to use that? How are we able to use that funding to be able to support low and moderate income individuals? We're going to pause just for a second. We have a little bit of feedback. And then if you look at the bottom graphic, as we're thinking about how we support low and moderate income individuals, the focus is on different activities like housing and other things that support housing, like purchasing land to support housing. Also public facilities like the facility that we're in today, Thrive, helping ensure that those public facilities are vibrant and well-maintained places, as well as public services. So in the city of Lewisville, they have a very vibrant program to support local nonprofits that are providing vital public services to the residents of the city of Lewisville, and a certain percentage of CDBG funding can be used to support those nonprofits. So in this planning process, some of these things are happening parallel. So we are gathering a lot of data from the census and other local hard data sources to determine what are the needs in the city of Lewisville. But at the end of the day, that process would not be complete without getting stakeholder feedback, because the census could capture some information, but your lived experiences are really what will help us understand what should be those priorities for the city of Lewisville. And then we'll set those priorities. Because we can't tackle everything within 5 years, and so we've got to focus on really what are those needs and those priorities that we should focus on immediately. Then the city will look at how much resources they have, financial resources and people resources, to devote to some of these activities. We'll set goals, we'll administer the program, and the city will report back and be transparent about how successful they are in implementing those activities. So now we're going to switch to the second plan that we're focused on, which is the assessment of fair housing. So the Fair Housing Act has been around for decades and focuses on certain protected classes that traditionally had experienced barriers to accessing housing that was safe, decent, and affordable. And that includes people who were denied housing based on their race, color, national origin, religion, sex, familial status, and disability. And so you can see there are a number of goals that the Fair Housing Act wants cities to try to achieve, because at the end of the day, the Fair Housing Act is meant to prevent discrimination, but if you're a city that receives federal funding, you also have a duty to affirmatively further fair housing. So you need to be taking steps to make those opportunities available to individuals and families so that you can address any disparities between certain protected classes, experiencing more housing problems, not being able to access housing in certain neighborhoods. So is there segregation that's occurring? Are certain families not able to access neighborhoods that have high opportunities, that have access to good transportation and good schools? So those are some of the things that the city will be working on in the city's planning and then implementing after we develop the assessment of fair housing. So this may be a little hard to see for some of the folks that are in the back, but when we're looking at the assessment of fair housing, we're looking at what contributes to families not being able to access housing in the city of Lewisville. And these are not necessarily all evident or prevalent in the city of Lewisville, but it's things that we can take into account, and we can come back to this slide at the end if we like. But these are things that sometimes can occur in a community that prevents families from accessing housing. And some of those things are private, can be private discrimination or private actions, and some of those are public actions, such as zoning. Do we prevent different types of housing from occurring in certain neighborhoods? Do we allow things like duplexes or triplexes that can be often offered at a lower price point for families? Do we have neighbors who don't want certain types of housing, or even, unfortunately, certain types of people living in their neighborhoods? And is there community opposition to housing or to families accessing opportunity? And so those are the things we'd like to explore today and get your feedback on. What do you think is happening in your community that is positive in terms of having all families be able to access housing? And what are some things that the city of Lewisville really needs to work on? And so you can see this, this map of how the planning process goes is very similar to what we looked at for the CDBG consolidated plan. So we're gonna look at the issues, just like with the CDBG plan, we looked at the needs. We're gonna look at what contributes to these problems. Again, we're gonna make priorities. We're gonna assess what are the things we should be working on over these next 5 years. We're gonna identify goals and metrics. We're gonna incorporate those goals into other plans like the consolidated plan, and then we're gonna evaluate performance. Again, we wanna make sure if we're making these efforts, are we being successful, or do we need to reset some things? And all of this is gonna be done by the end of the summer. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we're gonna be engaging really throughout the summer, both in more informal meetings like this meeting, as well as meetings where residents will have the chance to speak before the city council, if you'd like, to give your input on what these plans should look like. And then in August is when we'll submit this plan to HUD. They'll review it, give us feedback, and then the city will have access to its funding to be able to start implementing some of its goals. So now let's dig into data. So the median income in the city of Lewisville is about $67,000. So if you think back to your 3rd or 4th grade math class where you had mean, median, mode, median is that family that's right in the middle. So if we lined up really all of the individuals in the city of Lewisville, from those who had no income to the highest income earners, that person in the middle would earn $67,000. It doesn't really tell us a lot about the distribution of incomes, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But some of the things that can impact income are things like education, ability to speak English, because that is prevalent in the job market, as well as whether you have any disabilities that might prevent you from working and earning a higher income. And so if we compare the city of Lewisville to the state of Texas, we can see that the city of Lewisville is a more educated city. There's a higher percentage of households or individuals who have a bachelor's degree or higher. You could see slightly higher limited English proficiency in the city of Lewisville compared to the state of Texas, and slightly lower percentage of individuals who are disabled. And certainly we'd love your impact on how some of these factors may impact incomes in the city of Lewisville. And if we dig into this a little bit differently, we can look at, we have kind of the split. We have about 35% of households that are earning less than $50,000 a year. That's that distribution of income. And then about a quarter of households that are earning more than $100,000 a year. And so if we think about where we're going to be using the CDBG funding, it is focusing on those 35% of families that have incomes that are lower than $50,000, and that's where our efforts will be focused because of the regulations related to CDBG. And if we look at those factors related to education, again, we have a highly educated set of residents, but then we have 36% that their highest level of education is a high school diploma, and we know that can often impact what your earning potential is. And so that's certainly something to focus on. Lewisville is a young city. Only 8% of residents are 65 plus. And some of the main areas where residents are employed are in educational services, healthcare, and social services at 17%, as well as retail trade at 14%. If we look at where incomes are distributed throughout the city, so the city median income is $67,000. And I can read some of these up on the screen here. This is showing by census tract what the median income is in certain neighborhoods in the city. And so if you look at the dark purple, that's where the median income is $110,000 or higher, right? So that family still right in the middle in that neighborhood is $110,000, much higher than we're seeing of the citywide median income. And then if you look at the lightest color, that's a median income of $50,000 or less. So what this map does is show some of your higher income neighborhoods and some of your lower income neighborhoods. So if we want to think again, not only of targeting resources to low and moderate income households, but if we think of geographically, are there areas where we should focus our efforts geographically in the city of Lewisville to ensure that we're really reaching the hardest to reach families and the families that are in need of extra resources. And this presentation will be shared on the website soon too, so that if some of these things are hard to see, you'll be able to take a look at it after the meeting. So we've been talking a lot about income, and now let's talk about how that income can affect a family's ability to afford their housing. And so traditionally, an affordable housing payment is when you're paying 30% or less of your income on housing and housing-related costs, like property taxes if you're a homeowner, or things like renter's insurance and utilities if you're a renter. And so if we use that city median income, and we do a little bit of a calculation about a family that is paying an affordable payment, a housing payment, they would be able to spend about $20,000 a year on their housing payment. And so if we divide that by 12 and we look at what would that be on a monthly basis, they would be able to afford about a $1,700 payment for, in this instance, we were looking at rent. And so just anecdotally, if we think about what rents are in the city of Lewisville, this family likely would be able to access housing and have an affordable housing payment. But now if we look at the distribution of incomes, and if we start looking again at those families that are making $50,000 or less, you can see this is just another way to display that we not only have about 14% of our families that are making $35,000 to $50,000 a year, but we have 10% of families that are making $25,000 to $35,000, and even additional percentages of families that are making less than that, or are on fixed income and other benefits where it's a very low amount of earnings or income that are coming into the family. And so if we start looking at who's the type of person that might be earning an income that's around $50,000, that, for example, might be a legal secretary. And we're pulling this data from local data sources really for the area. A bus driver might be that individual who's earning around $35,000 a year. And if we're thinking about our folks working in the food industry, a short order cook earns about $25,000 a year. And so if we do that calculation that we did on the other page, looking at paying only 30% of your income on housing costs, this is what those individuals would be able to afford for a housing payment. And so you start looking at $1,200 or $800 or $600 a month. That's where we start to get a lot more nervous, because those individuals are frankly right now not going to be able to afford housing in the city of Lewisville. And so thinking about different strategies that can help those individuals stay in the city of Lewisville, stay and keep their children enrolled in the city of Lewisville ISD and not be burdened by housing costs, those are the things that we're really trying to solve for today. So this also helps us think about other factors that impact the cost of housing in the city of Lewisville. So what this is showing is the type of housing units that exist in the city of Lewisville. So if you look on the far left-hand side, about 40% of your housing units are single-family homes in the city of Lewisville. And then if you look more to the right, 16% of your housing units are 10 to 20 unit multifamily apartment complexes, so smaller apartment complexes, but still probably are on the edge of single-family neighborhoods or right in the middle of multifamily neighborhoods. And another 22% of your housing is 20 or more units. So those could be much, much larger apartment complexes that have 200 to 300 units. But if you look in the middle, one unit attached, like townhomes or duplexes or triplexes, some of those housing types that really can fit well into single-family neighborhoods but offer a more affordable price point for a family because you've got more units on a parcel of land. Very, very few of those in the city of Lewisville. So that's one thing as we work with cities across the country that we look at. Is this something that could help impact housing affordability if you're allowing more types of housing units to be developed? And then if we look at that, if we parse the data a little bit differently and we look at number of bedrooms and how that's split in the city, you can see really all the way to 3 bedrooms, you've got a good percentage, you've got a high percentage of units throughout the city that offer 3, 2, or 1 bedrooms. But if you start looking at larger families, including multi-generational families, that may need 4 or more bedrooms, very, very small percentage. 12% of the units offer 4 bedrooms in the city, and then only 2% offer 5 or more. So again, if we're thinking about if what's impacting a family is being able to access a housing unit that really fits their needs, a larger family or a multi-generational family may not be able to access that in the city of Lewisville. So how do we see that play out in neighborhoods? Families get overcrowded. They're in smaller units than they really should be. And as we think about how that may play out in a neighborhood, we may see more parking on the street. We may see congestion with traffic because we've got families that really should be in a larger housing unit, but they're not able to find it in the city of Lewisville. So again, that could be another issue that we can tackle with CDBG funding. And so if we think about the incomes and we think about the cost of housing in the city of Lewisville, what we're seeing and what we've seen even in past consolidated plans is one of the biggest issues facing residents in the city of Lewisville is cost burden. So even though they should be paying only 30% of their income on housing, we have both homeowners and renters that are paying much, much higher percentage of their housing or of their income on housing. 1 in 3 households in the city of Lewisville report that they're housing cost burdened. And more renters than homeowners are housing cost burdened. And we're going to see that as we look at some maps that are in this presentation. You can see this is to look at trends of how housing cost burden has trended over the past few years. And you can see that renters really, it's remained relatively stable, but unfortunate that about 40% of renters in the city of Lewisville are housing cost burdened. Whereas homeowners, we're seeing at least a little bit of a trend that's starting to go down, and it's at about 20% of homeowners in the city right now are housing cost burdened. Certainly looking at those trends, again, helps the city determine where should we prioritize our efforts. And certainly if you look at this right now, maybe prioritizing more of addressing housing cost burden with renters is likely a better priority right now than focusing all of the efforts on homeowners. But certainly there still is an issue with that 20% of those homeowners, who more than likely, as we dig deeper into the data, are probably elderly, may also be disabled, and are on fixed income. So as property taxes and other housing maintenance costs rise, that's where their housing costs are really starting to burden them. And this is another way just to look at when we think about housing cost burdens and why we're focusing on low and moderate income families. Anybody of any income can become housing cost burdened. If you're paying more than 30% of your income on your housing costs, you're considered housing cost burdened. But if you have a higher income and that housing cost starts to eat into your income, you still have a bigger share of your income, or you have more income that's still available for all of your other expenses. But as a lower income family starts having rising housing costs, the rent eats first, right? And so things like being able to pay for health care, being able to pay for childcare services, being able to increase your education, those are the things that fall out when a family's housing costs start really eating up more of the income. So if we're thinking about where individuals live who are housing cost burdened, that darker purple are higher percentages of homeowners that are housing cost burdened. And so that's about 30% of the homeowners in the areas that are darker purple report being housing cost burdened. So if we think across the city, it was 20% of homeowners. But now as we dig in geographically, we can see that there are certain areas where homeowners are experiencing more of that housing cost burden. And we certainly know that in some of those areas, right in kind of the central part of Lewisville, that there are a number of mobile home communities, and they're categorized as homeowners. So it's likely that many of those residents of the mobile home communities are in this share of individuals who are housing cost burdened. And you can see it's not always the same depending on whether you're an owner or a renter. And so these are the areas of the city where renters are reporting that they're housing cost burdened, but it's much higher percentages. So the darkest purple, 56% of renters are reporting that they're housing cost burdened. And even as you go into the lighter blue, that's where you have about 40 to 47% of renters who are reporting that they're housing cost burdened. So much higher percentages than we're seeing on the homeowner side. And now in this next map, we can tell, because we know that the purple is more people, right, or a higher percentage, this is your lower income renters, right? So the last map was renters of any income that were reporting housing cost burden. Now this is lower income renters. And in the areas that are the darkest purple, 90% of renters are low-income renters are indicating that they're housing cost burdened. So almost everyone who's earning a lower income in some of these neighborhoods is paying more than really they should be for housing, for them to be able to manage all the other costs that their household has. So this is certainly a worrisome map. So transitioning from housing to homelessness, which is something we also look at, and which CDBG funds can be used to address. This is where we need a lot of feedback, and one of the questions I'll be asking at the end of the presentation is who else should we be talking to, who else should be in the room? But because the city participates in a broader consortium in terms of addressing homelessness, sometimes the data is collected at county levels, and it doesn't really filter to allow us to figure out what are the specific homelessness issues that the city of Lewisville, that residents in the city of Lewisville are facing. We've already gotten some stakeholder feedback about encampments that exist in the city and appear to be growing, but we really need your feedback on what's happening. But we have talked to individuals, for example, from the school district that are talking about seeing students that are doubling up or that are couch surfing. And we know that there are some public services, there are some nonprofits that are attempting to address this need for youth in the city. And so we need your feedback on, is this something that the city should continue to support or even increase their support for? Another thing that we look at is natural hazard risk, and this is especially important when we're thinking about the mobile home communities in the city of Lewisville. You know, what are the risks in terms of severe thunderstorms, flooding, high winds? What are other issues that may be more prevalent in the city than in other areas of Texas or in other areas of the country? And there are elevated risks for things like severe thunderstorms in this part of North Texas. And so, love the map. So here's another map. So if you look on the left-hand side, that's where you have a high percentage of mobile home units. And then if you look at the map on the right side, that's where you have elevated flood risk. And so you can see that there is some troubling overlap where some of the mobile home communities are located and where there's a higher elevated flood risk. And certainly we've heard that this has happened in some of the mobile home communities where they have experienced flooding. So one of the things you can use CDBG funding for is infrastructure, such as flood control, flood management. And so that may be something that the city may want to focus on with either their CDBG dollars or other resources. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I really want feedback from folks who are here today or who are tuning in online, but I wanted to give you a little overview of what we're hearing so far. We're early in the process, and so this will continue to shift and change as we get more feedback. But we're hearing some of the same things that the data is showing is a problem. Housing affordability. Stakeholders are very concerned about lower and moderate income families being able to afford and access housing in the city of Lewisville. They're seeing families, for example, families in the school that have children in the school district are really struggling as emergency rental assistance is starting to dwindle down, and leases are coming up for renewal. We're seeing a lot of landlords that are raising the rent once your contract comes to an end. And families are not able to make up that gap of even $100 change in their rent because they already were housing cost burdened. So that extra $100 sometimes is just not feasible for the families to be able to pay. We have heard too about the need for repair programs or the continued need for repair programs. We talked to some folks that operate Meals on Wheels, and they said that they have a number of seniors that they serve that are in single family homes but maybe only use one or two of the rooms in the home because the rest of the rooms are not accessible to them. They've developed disabilities or they were disabled in the first place, and their bathroom is not accessible. Their kitchen, they can't reach their kitchen cabinets, and so they may be spending a lot of time in a living room, sleeping in the living room because the rest of their home is just not accessible for them. We've also heard about, as I mentioned earlier, overcrowding. So not only one family being in a unit that's really not big enough for them, but because families are having to double up and use the income from multiple adults to be able to pay just for one housing unit. And so you get adults and children that are living in living rooms and other things because you may have 10 or 11 or 12 or even more people living in a one-bedroom or a two-bedroom unit because that's the only thing that their incomes allow them to afford. So hopefully everybody who is tuning in online and who's here today will take the community needs assessment. This is where we're, again, gathering more data on what you think the needs are in the community and what the city's priorities should be. But we're seeing that there is some very, I want to say, very thoughtful responses. We have an option that says, I just don't know, right? So you can say whether you agree or strongly agree or disagree with some of these statements, and then you can say, I don't know enough. And people are being very thoughtful about what they do have personal experience with and what they don't know. I will say, just highlighting affordability, this is probably one of the questions where there's really very little nuance or very little disagreement, that if a family of four was only able to pay $1,000 a month for a housing payment, that they would not be able to access housing in the city of Lewisville. So that's something where we've been getting really strong. 78% at least are saying that they believe that family wouldn't be able to access housing. And we've been getting very, very good feedback in the general comments about what other issues are, including